Hello, and welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, founder of the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, consumer of too much coffee, and a massive fan of magnesium to calm my nervous system down. And today I'm exploring a question a lot of horse owners ask. Do calming supplements actually work? But before we talk about magnesium, vitamin B1, tryptophan, and all the other ingredients you see in calmers, we need to ask a more important question. Why is your horse behaving this way in the first place? Because behaviour is information. A horse that is spooky, reactive, tense, anxious, or difficult to ride probably doesn't just need a stronger calmer. They're telling us something about their diet, their gut, their body, or their management. Too much grain or concentrated feed, not enough forage, an unsettled hindgut, gastric pain, being ridden on an empty stomach, lack of movement, lack of socialisation, pain, or an unbalanced diet are some of the things that can show up as behaviour. And if one of those things is driving the problem, tipping a calming supplement into the feed bin is going to be a bit like trying to put a bushfire out with a garden hose. Very unlikely to be effective. So in this episode, we'll first look at the feeding and management factors that really can affect behaviour. Then we'll look at some of the science behind the common calming supplement ingredients, including magnesium, vitamin B1 and tryptophan, because calm doesn't start in the supplement aisle. Very often it starts with the diet, the forage, your horse's gut and body, and the way they are managed. This is a big topic, so buckle in with me and let's go. I have got notes everywhere for this topic because it is huge, and it's probably me being very overly ambitious in trying to fit it all into one episode. But where I want to go to first with this is actually have a look at some of the factors that can cause changes in behaviour. So when I'm talking about behaviour in this podcast, I'm talking about things that we would consider undesirable behaviour. So, way too much energy when they're ridden, unpredictability when you're handling them or riding them, just being generally spooky. Horses that are not calm to be around, and sometimes it's more they just don't feel safe to be around. So I want to have a look at where that kind of behaviour is coming from in some of our horses first before we move on to looking at calming supplements that are sometimes our instinctive thing to want to reach for when we've got a horse that is behaving in that way. The first thing that will cause those changes in behaviour, so that overly energetic, too responsive to aid, just too much energy, particularly when you're riding them. The place I go to always first is, well, how much energy is that horse getting in their diet? Because horses are funny creatures in that they will express the amount of energy in their diet through their behaviour. So if you're feeding a horse a high energy diet, that will come out in their behaviour. And I remember way back when I was a very young nutritionist and certainly didn't have the breadth of experience that I've got these days after doing this for 25 years. But I had my poet, who is turning 23 this year, so he's been in my life for a long time, and he'd basically tried to slice his heel bulb off on one of his front feet. And I remember it was Easter long weekend, it was wet, and the property that I lived on at the time was really boggy. It was like on a floodplain, and my horses essentially lived in mud up to their fetlocks the whole time, other than when they were in their big shelter shed where they had dry sawdust to come and stand in. So I couldn't leave him in that environment. He had to be in the shelter shed all the time, and I was going away for 4 or 5 days over Easter. And so my best solution was to send him into our local vet clinic and have them, wrap his foot for the period of time I was away and keep it dry and sort of hopefully let it heal. And I had left instructions for his feeding. So he was on, at the time, a vitamin mineral supplement that was about 100 grams a day, mixed in some chaff, and then just lots of hay. That was all he needed. And he, as a young horse, and still now as a 23-year-old, just so full of energy. He was one of those really, to be kind, I'll call it playful colts, but he was really full of himself as a young horse. He was well and truly gelded by this stage, but by the time I went to pick him up 4 or 5 days later, the vet nurses were refusing to go into the stable with him. And I said, what's going on? They said, oh, he's just crazy. And I said, really? And what I figured out had happened was they'd fed him workhorse mix, so really heavily grain-based and not very well cooked grain feed for that 4 or 5 days to a young horse locked in a stable, not allowed out to exercise because of his injury. And he was fine when I went in to catch him because he obviously knew me very well, but he had the vet nurses so scared that they just refused to go in with him anymore. And when I got him home, I was so worried about just letting him go with him hurting himself that I ended up just tying him to a very safe spot in a yard. And he stood there and read for 20, 30 minutes and carried on like a lunatic because he was just, it was like there was all this energy inside of him and he just needed to get it out. And it was such a good display of how horses will show you the amount of energy in their diet, in their behaviour. Now, there was no way that I was going to be getting on that horse anytime soon. He had an injured foot, so I couldn't ride him anyway. But if he was in that state, there is no way I would have tried to ride him because it really would have ended badly. And it would be unfair on him to expect him to behave when he was just so bursting with energy. So this is what happens in any horse, really. Some horses don't express the energy in their behaviour so much, but your more sensitive horses will. And I'm thinking, off the tracks definitely will. Any horse that has got that tendency to sort of be on the higher energy side. If you feed them more energy than they strictly need for their day-to-day activities, there is a very good chance that it will come out in their behaviour. So the very first place I want you to go, if you've got a horse that has got too much energy or, some days okay and some days it just feels like a wound up rubber band ready to go boing, go and have a look at their diet and see if you are actually managing their energy intake properly and if you're matching their energy intake to their energy requirement. And this is something you can do with the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, and you can do it on the free version. So you can go and download the free version, you don't even need to use the 7-day free trial, you just use the free version, but it will give you a breakdown of how much energy is in your horse's diet relative to the workload that you enter into the app. And with the workload, it doesn't just ask you, resting, light, moderate, heavy work. It actually allows you to build out your horse's week of activities. So if your horse is resting for 3 days and light work for 2 days and moderate work for the balance, then you can enter that into the app and get a very accurate estimate of what your horse's energy requirement is for a week. And if you're seeing your horse's energy on the upper side, like above what they actually require, then it might be as simple as adjusting what you're feeding in that horse's diet back down to where they're to match their requirement. So you're having their energy intake match their actual energy requirement. And that might be all you need to do to bring their behaviour back down. And certainly this is what I've seen time and time and time again in horses, is that once we get their energy intake under control, their behaviour will just modify itself back down to being nice, calm behaviour and much more consistent behaviour as well. So that's the first place I want you to go and check. If you've got a horse that is too hyperactive, go and grab the app and put your horse's diet in and just see where that energy comes out relative to what your horse's energy requirement actually is. The next thing on my list of nutrition influences on behaviour is, are they getting enough forage in their diet? And this is so critically important for behaviour for a number of reasons. So the first one is simply that horses have been evolving, as you will know if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, for 55 million years. And during that process of evolution over such a long time spans, a horse has evolved as a grazing animal, and they are designed to chew, and they will consume forage for 16 to 18 hours over 24-hour periods. So they spend a lot of their time finding food, finding forage, and then chewing it. So a part of behaviour can simply be that your horse is just not getting that mental stimulation of seeking food out and then spending the time chewing the forage. And I guess it's a little bit like, dogs are wired to chew as well because a lot of their food is just other animals that they've hunted and killed or found to eat. And so they're really, really wired to chew. And I think about puppies, and if you don't give puppies something to chew, then they will just start chewing on everything because it's instinctive for them. And we recognise that, I think, a lot better in dogs than what we do in horses, because in horses, they're just eating and we don't really think about it so much as a behaviour that they require. But it is absolutely a behaviour that they require. And that head down position too, I think, is really important for a horse, because if you go and spend some time with your horse or horses when they're in that head down, either grazing position or just they've got their head down eating hay, and watch their eyes. They go into this almost like meditative, dreamy kind of state. Their eyelids kind of close a little bit and they look like they're just in this really zen place. They're very, very happy with their head down grazing. So I do think that a part of anxious behaviour or hyperactive behaviour or just generally unhappy behaviour can sometimes be due to the fact that your horse is bored because it's standing around with nothing to chew on, and it's also not getting the stimulation of that chewing and the, I guess, the familiarity of having their head down. I'm sure there's an equine behavioural scientist would be able to explain this to you in a lot more detail, but coming from the nutritionist perspective, is just so important to keep feeding our horses in the way that they evolve to feed. And I think the closer we can get our horses in every aspect of nutrition to the way they evolve to eat, the happier they are, the calmer they are, and ultimately the healthier they will be. So that's one part of the effect of not enough forage. There's a couple of other really important parts. So one is, if you're not feeding enough forage, it is more likely that their stomach is going to be spending time not full of fibre. And you've also got large periods of time where the horse is not creating saliva. And those two factors will combine to put that horse at much higher risk of acid accumulation in the stomach being empty, and then acid splash, or simply the acid squeezing up in an empty stomach and burning the top part of the stomach that has no protection from the gastric acid. So I talk through that process in detail in episode number 2 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, where we take a walk down the entire gastrointestinal tract of the horse. So if you haven't listened to that episode, it's a really good one to go back and listen to. But for the context of behaviour, if we're not feeding enough forage, then there's a good chance that there's going to be some gastric pain going on, and that will change your horse's behaviour. If you've ever had a gastric ulcer yourself, you know how painful it can be. My daughter Tamaya a couple of nights ago was helping me make dinner, and she was squeezing a lime and she had a cut on her finger, and so she's jumping around the kitchen going, "Ow!" And I said, "What's up?" And she said, "There's lime juice in the cut on my finger." And I said, "Oh, that's what I tell people, gastric ulceration might feel a little bit like on a horse when you've got acid splashing around on an open wound in your stomach." So probably wasn't what she wanted me to say to her at the time. She may have lacked some sympathy, but this is one of the downsides of having an equine nutritionist as your mother. All that to say that if you have got any degree of ulceration and then you continue to have acid splash, you can't expect a horse to behave calmly or safely or reliably when that's going on inside their stomach. So we have to be really conscious of that. And the best way to prevent any of that going on is just making sure that they have got access to lots of forage and 24/7 access to that forage, so that they can constantly be chewing and salivating and keeping their stomach full of fibre. And then the other part of not enough forage is that further on down the gastrointestinal tract, when we get to the hindgut, if you don't have enough forage going into the diet, you won't have enough fibre in the hindgut, and then we will start to lose hindgut microbial populations. And those hindgut microbes are incredibly important when it comes to behaviour. And I'll talk a lot more about this a little bit later in the podcast. But suffice to say for now that forage is so important, and enough forage is so important, so that we're feeding the very beneficial fibre fermenting microbes and keeping their population strong and healthy, because they're the microbes that are meant to be in a horse's hindgut in large numbers, and they're most likely to be the ones that are talking via the gut-brain axis and keeping behaviour, I guess, just normal for a horse. We don't want to dull them down or sedate them or anything like that. We just want them to be able to respond to stimuli in a normal manner and to be able to interact with us and their herd mates in a normal manner. So just keeping lots of forage in their hindgut keeps that system that is so ingrained, 55 million years of evolution ingrained into a horse. It just keeps it all working as it should be working. And then the other little part of that, and which I talk about consistently throughout the podcast, and you'll hear it in lots and lots of places. And I think if you go back to episodes 9, 10 and 11, something like that, there's lots of information about the hindgut microbe and feeding for a healthy hindgut. But another part of this is to make sure that we're feeding a variety of forage so that we are getting fibre variety, and then that fibre variety is able to support a diverse microbiome, because we also know in other animal species that a diverse microbiome is important for normal behaviour. So I imagine that is the same is true, and they potentially and hopefully is some research around this in horses, or if not now, hopefully soon there will be some research in horses around this. But we do know from studies that when we feed a high starch diet versus a high fibre diet, we do see behavioural changes, and at least a part of that will be something to do with hindgut microbial diversity. Another factor that will affect behaviour that I would want to rule out before we went reaching for any calming supplements to change behaviour would be, is the horse being ridden on an empty stomach or a full stomach? So this is a little bit of a mind bend for us as humans, because we're meal feeders, and to us, exercising on a full stomach feels so terrible. And in fact, if you try to run, if you're like me and pretty much every other human that I know, if you try to run on a full stomach, you end up getting a stitch. And it's painful and makes you stop running, and it's something that I was really conscious of. If I'm ever going to run, I have to make sure that I eat far enough ahead that I'm not hungry when I go running, but that my stomach has also had time to empty, so that I'm not running on a full stomach, because it's so very uncomfortable. So as a human, it's actually really hard to get our head around. It's the opposite for horses. So you have to remember, we are predators, and we have the luxury of saying when we're going to go and chase after prey or not. Prey animals don't have that luxury. So I often say to people, a horse couldn't say to the saber-toothed tiger that was about to eat it, could you just hang on a minute? I've just eaten, and it's actually going to be very difficult to run away from you, but in about half an hour I'll be fine and you can chase me then. If a saber-toothed tiger popped up out of the long grass, they just had to run. And because they eat and graze constantly, their entire digestive system is designed around that stomach being full all the time, and it is their natural state to run with a full stomach. And we shouldn't make them exercise when their stomach is empty, because the acid that is continuously secreted into the bottom part of the stomach, which is protected from the acid, will splash up to the top part of the stomach, which is completely unprotected from the acid, and it will literally just burn holes through the lining of the upper part of the stomach. So if you are riding your horse without feeding your horse hay first, there is a chance, and depending on how meal fed and how many hours since the last forage feed your horse had, a very good chance that you'll be riding your horse with an empty stomach that is also full of highly acidic acid. And if we leave horses for 4 to 6 hours without chewing on forage, the pH of the acid in their stomach can go as low as 1, which is essentially like battery acid. And then the movement and the exercise will splash that acid then up onto the top part of the stomach and burn holes and cause gastric ulceration. But the other thing it also causes is large amounts of pain. And your horse will try to tell you that in its behaviour. It will try to tell you that it's hurting. It can't speak to you. So the only option it's got is to behave in certain ways to try and make you realise that something's not right. So if you have got a horse that is difficult in its behaviour and you are not yet feeding hay before you ride, I'd really encourage you, and in fact, if I was in front of you, I would beg you to feed your horse hay before you ride. Now, alfalfa or lucerne hay is the best because it is a natural buffer, so it will actually buffer the acid and increase the pH naturally by itself, as well as generating the saliva that it takes to chew it and creating the fiber mat in the stomach to physically stop the acid from splashing. But if you don't feed lucerne for any reason and you would prefer to feed grass hay, that's nearly as good because you still get the saliva production, you still get the fiber mat, you just don't get the natural buffering that you get from the alfalfa. So feed any kind of hay before you ride. And I've had so many people over the years walk up to me and say, oh my goodness, I started doing that and the difference in my horse is amazing. So please try that. If you haven't been feeding hay, please do. And I'm almost certain that you will see a change in behaviour without any kind of calming supplement required. So hay in this situation essentially becomes your calming supplement. And in fact, forage is our calmer for horses. It does so much to calm horses down. We've talked about a lot of them already and there's a lot more to come. So just keep your brain focused on the fact that so much of this comes down to the amount of forage we feed, the type of forage we feed, the variety of forage we feed. And if my experience is that when we get the forage part of a horse's diet right and we also manage their grain intake, then their behaviour is almost always pristine. Pristine in that it's normal for that horse. So I just mentioned grain and I will talk about that a little because if you feed too much grain or if you feed grain that is uncooked or poorly processed, so cooked a little bit but not very much, when you feed that grain, a lot of the starch in that grain will travel undigested through the small intestine and then end up in the hindgut. And when it ends up in the hindgut, the myelolytic starch-loving bacteria will grab hold of it and ferment it really rapidly and create an excess of volatile fatty acids, and they'll create lactic acid, which can't be absorbed from the hindgut. And all of this acid essentially drops the pH in the hindgut and it will shut down and then eventually kill off the good fibre fermenting bacteria, which are the ones that your horse relies on for normal behaviour. And there would also be some pain associated if you get to the point where your horse has actually got hindgut acidosis, because we know in ruminants that when they've got acidosis, they basically just burn their rumen wall off. And in animals that die from acidosis, it's just the rumen wall just sloughs off, goes black, and it's a really, really unhealthy state for a rumen to be in and a very, very unhealthy state for a hindgut to be in. If you can check your horse's fecal pH as a quick little indicator of where your horse's hindgut health is, and you can just buy a soil test pH kits that are a bottle of liquid and then a bottle of white powder and follow the instructions on the box. They cost about $25. So really, really cheap little management tool to use to check if you're worried that you might be feeding too much grain or the grain that's not digestible. Check the pH. Ideally, we want it above 6.2. We shouldn't have fecal pH below 6.2 because that's when the real problems start. I talk about grain feeding and doing it well, feeding grain safely in horses in episode 45 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast. So if you want to follow up on more information specifically on that piece, go back to episode 45 and have a listen to that. It is the topic that I did my original PhD on, so it's a subject area I know very, very well. And it's so important that we feed grain safely to horses, and it is one of the fastest ways to negatively change their behaviour is to either feed too much grain or to feed undigestible grain and then to go in and cause microbial dysbiosis in their hindgut, and then that will flow on to changed behaviours, and it is often very anxious behaviour, very hyperactive behaviour and unpredictable and unsafe behaviour that you'll get from horses when they're on too much grain. So please go and listen to that episode. It's really, really important and it will cover it in a lot more detail for you. The next one to think about is your horse getting enough freedom and enough exercise and enough socialisation? So if you have a horse that is in a small yard or a stable for large parts of the day and it's not able to just freely exercise, one, you're reducing that horse's natural use of energy. So its energy requirement when it's confined like that is actually going to be a little bit lower than a horse that is out walking and grazing and using energy outdoors. This isn't really a nutrition thing, but I just wanted to mention it anyway as a factor to take into account. So do have a look at your horse's management and whether they're getting that free time, or whether, are you taking them out and trying to ride them and then all of a sudden their behaviour is not what you wanted because they've got some freedom now that they're out of their yard or their stable, and they want to express that freedom in their behaviour, and that's not necessarily what you want them to do when you're on their back. So do have a think about their behaviour from that perspective. And the last one I just want to touch on before I go to actually 3 big ones. There's so many things that can affect behaviour. We've got 3 big ones to go, but I just want to mention pain as well. Also not nutritional unless it's gastric pain that has been caused, as we've talked about, with gastric ulcers or hindgut acidosis. But is your horse's behaviour your horse trying to tell you something? We talk a lot about this in episode 46, Horse Depression, Behaviour and Nutrition with Joanna Lepiacic. So if you're interested in exploring this a little bit more, go back and have a look. It's a beautiful episode. It was such a lovely conversation with Joanna, and I thoroughly enjoyed that interview and also learnt a lot. And we talk a lot about behaviour there. So I'd encourage you to go, and it's like I'm giving you homework, encourage you to go and listen to that one as well. But I want to move on to 3 big nutritional ones. There's 3 more big nutritional ones because the ones that we've already talked about are big from a behaviour perspective. So the first one is an unbalanced diet. There are certain things we can feed in diets that will unbalance the diet, which will then have an impact potentially on behaviour. So we've covered energy. If you overfeed energy, you will nearly always get hyperactive behaviour. But there are others. And just as an example, one is excessive amounts of calcium. So if you feed lots and lots of calcium, you will actually shift the absorption and metabolism of magnesium in a horse's body, and then that has potential to affect behaviour. And I've seen this quite a lot over the years. So in Australia, we have lots of high oxalate grasses, so things like buffel grass and kikuyu and soteria. And those grasses require us to feed a lot of calcium, sometimes obscene amounts of calcium, to make sure that we're counteracting the calcium binding and calcium stealing effect of those grasses. Because if we don't supplement a horse with calcium, horses on those grasses end up very, very calcium deficient, and they will literally end up dragging so much calcium out of their bone to maintain their blood calcium levels that their bones become very brittle, and then they will break bones. And sadly, sometimes the first an owner knows about that going on in their horses when their horse has got a broken bone. So in those situations, to counteract the effect of those grasses, we have to feed lots of calcium. And early in my career, what I hadn't realised is that if we just go and put a whole heap of calcium into that horse's diet, we are then actually negatively affecting magnesium. And what I started to see was that horses would do really well. We'd put them on these higher calcium diets, and they would be less sore because they often get grouchy because they're in pain. Their skeleton becomes so brittle it actually becomes painful. And one of the early symptoms of big head disease or nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, there is also an episode on that in this podcast. If anyone wants to go and it has those grasses and you want to go and listen to that, I can't tell you the number, but you'll find it somewhere in the list, or just search for it in your podcast player. What I started to see was that we'd put horses on extra calcium and their behaviour would improve because they felt better all of a sudden, because we were filling their bones back up with calcium and making their skeleton feel better. But then long term, I would see these weird behavioural changes. And what I started to do was go, I wonder if we've messed up magnesium and putting so much calcium in these diets. This was before we really had started, or before I had really started paying any attention to calcium-magnesium ratio in diets. And so when we started also putting some magnesium into those diets, we would see behaviour come back to normal. That's interesting. Lots and lots of calcium will affect magnesium, and sometimes, not in all horses, but in some horses you'll get this strange change in behaviour. So there's just one imbalance that we can see in horses that can affect, in some horses, their behaviour. Again, the My Happy Horse Nutrition app will track all of that for you. So it will tell you if you need to add extra calcium, and it will also track the calcium to magnesium ratio to make sure that in adding calcium in, for whatever reason you need to add it in, you are also not unbalancing magnesium in the diet. And for anyone who might be using a calcified marine algae gut supplement, I love that ingredient. It is such a cool ingredient, but you do need to be really conscious of the fact that when you're using one of those ingredients, if the product hasn't been balanced up for magnesium, you may need to do that yourself in the diet. But put your diet through My Happy Horse and just see where calcium comes out, see where the calcium to magnesium ratio comes out, and then you can make a decision based on data for your horse and based on your horse's actual requirements and diet. Hey, while you were listening, there's a lot of nutrition advice out there. Some of it's good, a lot of it's not, and most of it wasn't written for your horse. The My Happy Horse Nutrition app helps you build a diet that's specific to your horse, their weight, their workload, their forage, their quirks. No generic plans, no guessing, because the best person to take care of your horse is you when you have the right information. Find it at myhappy.horse or on the App Store. Okay, back to the show. The next factor that can affect behaviour, and this can have a really dramatic effect on behaviour, and that is mycotoxins. So some mycotoxins, and particularly the ones we find in grasses like ryegrass or fescues, the lolatrims and the ergovalines, they can have a massive impact on behaviour. And in fact, this has just popped into my mind, so I'll say it without going back and doing my research on it, but there was I've forgotten the name of the witch hunt now, one of the most famous witch hunts in history. And I can't remember how many, in inverted commas, witches were put to death. But many years later, as in hundreds or, 100 years later maybe, what researchers realised was that a lot of the women who were put to death for being witches were probably affected by an ergot alkaloid. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on that, I'm pretty sure it was an ergot mycotoxin, which does kind of make you seem like you're crazy. It changes human behaviour quite dramatically, and it used to be really common. They'd get contaminated grain, and then that grain would end up in bread, and then humans would eat the bread, and then their behaviour would change. And back then, when they didn't know any better, they just thought all of these women were witches, and so they were killing them because they were witches. So mycotoxins can have extreme effects on behaviour. And I was told years ago, and I must go and confirm this, but that one of the ryegrass mycotoxins, I think it was lolotrim, gets metabolised to something that's similar to LSD. And so sometimes I say to people, there's a chance that your horse actually is seeing a goblin behind that tree and is so freaked out, because you see horses on these mycotoxin pastures, and the confusing thing is, I think for us as horse owners, is not all horses are reactive to them. So you might have one horse out of 10 or 15 that is really affected, and the others might be completely unaffected or a little bit affected. So it's sort of hard to look at that horse and go, oh, it must be the pasture, because none of the other horses that are grazing with it are affected. So it's not an instinctive thing to go, oh, that horse must be affected by the pasture. But if you get a horse that starts behaving in a way that is very uncharacteristic for that horse, so it could be that it is just more reactive to things touching it. So if flies are landing on it, for example, it's like more irritated than what you would ever expect it to be. Or if it will kick for no reason, or kick when you touch it, or if it's just spooky or won't stay in its paddock. I remember years ago a gorgeous big show jumper that had been imported from the USA to South Australia. They couldn't keep it in its paddock. It was a show jumper, so it just kept jumping out of everywhere they put it, and they could not control this horse. And it wasn't until we figured out that it was probably the pasture that was affecting the horse, and got it off the pasture and managed to keep it confined in a yard for long enough to stop it from eating the pasture, that its behaviour settled right down quite quickly, like within a week, that we realised it was the pasture that was affecting this horse so much. So don't be misled by the fact that only one horse is affected. If you've got a pasture that has potential for mycotoxins, say a ryegrass pasture or a tall fescue pasture, and you get a horse behaving in a way that is really unpredictable, then do suspect mycotoxins and try taking them off that pasture and putting them on a hay that is not those grass species and not cut from that property, to see if their behaviour changes back. I was talking to Renee, who is using the My Happy Horse app, a couple of nights ago, and she was saying her horse was at one adjustment property, very, very eaten down pasture, and his behaviour was not what she wanted. Let's say that is very hyperactive, difficult to manage, and she said to me, he was an off the track standardbred. She said to me it was nearly the end for him. Like if we couldn't figure it out, then he wasn't going to be able to stay with her because she couldn't handle him. And then she moved adjustment to a place that's got beautifully managed pastures and horse friendly mixes of pasture, which is beautiful to have if you can find it. And his behaviour changed completely. And I said, and she was thinking it might have been the feed that she was having him on. And I said, I think the way that you're describing it, I reckon that maybe he was mycotoxin affected. And those grazed down pastures are one of the highest risk pastures because the plant is stressed. And when the plant is stressed, then its little friend, the endophyte fungi, jumps into gear and starts to produce the mycotoxins to try and protect the plant. So very grazed down pastures and also very long pastures that have been allowed to go to seed are your highest risk. So if you're on any type of high risk pasture for mycotoxin and you get these dramatic changes, first thing I would think of is it's possibly mycotoxin, and I would get them off the pasture to see if you can get their behaviour back down to normal. And then the last one that I will talk about, there is others, but the last one I'm talking about today is gut health. And this topic is honestly so big that I could do 20 podcasts and we still wouldn't have scratched the surface on all of the things that, all of the interactions in a horse's body that go between gut health and behaviour. It's a massive area. And to demonstrate to you how important gut health is in behaviour, I went looking for some pretty mind-blowing research in humans to show you how much gut health in our body affects our behaviour. And I found a paper published by Kelly et al. In 2016. And it showed, and I love this stuff because it is mind-boggling to me. It showed that if you take a depressed human's fecal matter and transplant that into rats that have been treated with antibiotic to essentially wipe out their native microbes, so that they, for the period of time that they're having the human fecal microbiome transplant, they'll have the human microbes in their gut. The rats that got a fecal transplant from depressed humans started to show anhedonia, which was a work, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it properly. I had to look up the word, but it's a word that means a reduced ability in humans to feel pleasure, show interest or enjoyment. And it's kind of like your brain's reward system just being really dampened down, like it goes quiet. Nothing sort of gives you joy. That's my interpretation of it from what I read. And anxiety-like behaviours. So they took the microbiome from a human and put it into a rat, and that's what happened to the rat. So it's like far out. There's just so many interactions between what is living in our gut and our behaviour. So there's the gut-brain axis, and it's really hard to explain all of this as briefly as I am now because it's such a big area and I'm probably not doing it justice. Well, not probably not. I'm definitely not doing it justice in explaining it so quickly. But there is the gut-brain axis, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and it is essentially communication between what's going on in our gut with our brain. It happens in us. It happens in our horses. There's lots of components to it. One of those components is the impact that the gut microbes have on our production of hormones like serotonin. So in humans, serotonin is looked at as a hormone that controls our emotional regulation and our impulse control, so that ability to pause before acting. It has influences on our stress response. The impact of serotonin is massive in our bodies, and it's produced by the I love this word. I find it hard to say. Enterochromaffin cells. Got it? In the gut. So it's not produced by the microbes themselves. It is produced by our human cells But what they've shown in mice is that if you take germ-free mice, so mice that do not have a gut microbiome, they produce 60% less serotonin. And then if you recolonize those or colonize those mice guts with healthy microbes, their serotonin production is restored. So the microbes are not producing the serotonin as such, but they're controlling how much serotonin actually gets produced by our human cells. Like, it's crazy. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because we evolved alongside these microbes. So there wasn't a point where evolution stopped and went, hang on a minute, what happens if humans invent macas or, sugar and start to wipe out all of these microbes that we're evolving alongside? Evolution can't look forward like that. So our body is so wired up to have the right microbes in our gut so that we are producing the right hormones to run our body properly. Now, there isn't as detailed research in horses, but we do know that serotonin is produced by those same cells in their gastrointestinal tract, and the assumption would be that there has to be some kind of microbial interaction going on in our horses' guts as well, like there is in humans and like there is in mice. So that's one part of how the microbes in a horse's gut will affect behaviour. And then there's other situations where the microbes do actually produce hormones that have an influence on behaviour themselves. So one of the most well-known ones and examples used the most in humans is dopamine. And there is, schools of thought to say that a majority of the dopamine in a human body is actually made by our gut microbes. We don't know this specifically in horses, but it's another part of the gut-brain axis that we need to think about, and we need to think about, well, how do we feed our horses in a way that is supporting their normal microbial population, so that whatever those microbes have normally done for horses throughout evolution, they can continue to do, so that we maintain normal behaviour. Like I said, this is a massive topic. I'm skipping over and really, really simplifying stuff here just for the sake of time. And I must find someone who's a expert in this space to interview, because, man, it would be interesting to dig into this stuff in a much deeper way. I see this interaction between gut health and behaviour in horses so much. So it's not, I guess my experience here is not so much what the research and what science says, even though there's plenty of research and science to back up what I'm saying, but I just see it over and over and over and over again, that if we unbalance a horse's hindgut by not feeding enough forage, or not feeding enough forage diversity, or feeding too much grain, or feeding a grain that is indigestible in the small intestine, we get changes in behaviour. We get undesirable changes in behaviour. So if you are feeding in a way that is really focusing on maximising hindgut health, you are going to reap the benefits in behaviour. So it's so important. Can't stress it enough. If you go and have a listen to episode 54 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, you will hear an interview with Zach, and talking about how, essentially halving the amount of grain they were feeding in yearling sales prep and improving gut health gave them much better behaviour and much calmer and happier yearlings while they were in yearling prep. It's a cool story, and it's what I see consistently when we feed in a way that supports hindgut health and also gastric health in the stomach, but particularly hindgut health. You will get lovely, calm behaviour. So my estimation is that if you feed in a way that covers off all of those points we just talked about, so controls the amount of energy that your horse is getting in their feed, you're making sure your horse is getting enough forage, and that there's some level of diversity of forage. You're feeding hay before you ride so that you're never feeding your horse on an empty stomach. You're making sure that forage is available 24/7, making sure that your horse has got enough freedom and exercise and socialisation, and there's no pain driving behaviour. Your diet is balanced. You don't have your horse on a pasture or a hay that is giving them a dose of mycotoxin that will change their behaviour, and you're feeding to support gut health. I would hazard a guess that 95% of you would not no longer have behavioural issues. So it's really worth digging around in all of those areas of your horse's diet. We can definitely help you with all of that. So the My Happy Horse Nutrition app will help you get energy levels right and make sure you've got enough forage, and it will give you a gut health score so that you're trying to get enough fibre diversity into the horse's diet so that their gut's nice and healthy, and make sure that all of your vitamins and minerals are provided and that your mineral ratios are all balanced, all of those things. And if you get your horse's diet balanced in that way, most of your issues with behaviour will go away. There is some situations, and in fact there is some horses in some situations where a calming supplement may be useful. So let's move on to looking at calming supplements and whether they do work. So here's the first point to make, is that if something is wrong in your horse's diet, or your horse is in pain, or they've got gut health issues, the question of will a calming supplement work is probably going to be no. The answer to that question is probably going to be no, because you can't use a calming supplement to cover up a problem that is not being caused by whatever nutrient or nutraceutical is in that calming supplement. So take, for example, hindgut dysbiosis that is being caused by feeding either too much grain or feeding raw grain in your horse's diet. A supplement that has magnesium and vitamin B1 is not going to be able to override the behavioural changes you're seeing that are being caused by pain from excess acid production in the hindgut and a loss of normal microbes and changes to the horse's gut-brain axis communication and changes to your horse's serotonin production from the enterochromaffin cells. I just love that word, love to say it, in the horse's intestine. So you can't expect to put a calming supplement into your horse's diet or give them a calming pace when you go to an event and have it override all of those things that are going on inside your horse or in your horse's diet. So in a lot of situations, calming supplements don't work because they're not being used in the correct situation for the horse, and the underlying cause of that behaviour is not being addressed. So really the only way we can modify a horse's behaviour without changing the underlying cause is if we sedate them. And that's not what we want to do, because we want to ride them safely. We don't want them sedated. But there is a couple of situations for some horses where calming supplements might actually have an effect. The first one is in situations where magnesium intake is not right for some reason. So I mentioned that, using feeding diets that are very high in calcium, so either you're on high oxalate grasses and need to supplement with calcium, or you might be using a calcified marine algae gut supplement to balance your diet that hasn't also been balanced with magnesium, and you need to add magnesium into the diet. In those situations, putting magnesium in and correcting magnesium balance in your horse's body will very likely have a calming effect, because magnesium is really tied up in nervous system function. We know in ruminant in dairy cattle that when they are magnesium deficient, and dairy cattle get very, very magnesium deficient when on the wrong diet, and they get a condition called grass tetany. But when it's not acute, the symptoms they show is that they will be nervous and have an overly alert appearance, and sometimes they'll be aggressive. So there is changes in behaviour that you get when magnesium intake is not right. I see it in my kids. Magnesium is something that we all take in this family. And in lots of adults I know, we don't sleep properly if we're magnesium deficient. We get restless leg syndrome, which is something that I get on a regular basis if I don't take magnesium. So there's lots around magnesium and behaviour. There's not a lot of studies in horses to show an effect of magnesium, but the problem is if you're supplementing horses, so say in a research situation, if you are supplementing horses with magnesium that aren't actually magnesium deficient, you're not going to see an effect. But there are some situations where I think supplementing with magnesium is a very good idea. And in fact, magnesium is added to lots of things. So in nearly every feed formulation I've ever done in my lifetime, there would be magnesium added to those feed formulations. Lots of supplement formulations I've done as well have magnesium added. But there's situations where extra magnesium might be needed. So, for example, if your horse is grazing a very lush green pasture with a high potassium content and reasonably low magnesium content, that high potassium can then change the dietary cation-anion balance in the diet, which then changes the acid-base balance in the horse's body. And the horse will actually become very alkaline on a high potassium diet. What we know in dairy cows is that when they consume these high potassium, high cation, anion difference diets, they actually become less responsive to parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is very intricately involved in magnesium and calcium absorption and metabolism. So when you get these very high potassium diets, there is potential for magnesium absorption and metabolism to be disturbed. We see the behavioural changes in dairy cattle, and we also talk to people with horses on these pastures. We also see changes in behaviour when horses are on these lush spring pastures. Now, it could be just that the horse is getting too much energy, but there is also potentially something going on with magnesium metabolism and absorption. And if you supplement a horse in that situation with extra magnesium and you see a response, then that probably tells you that, yes, magnesium was involved in there somewhere. So the nice thing about magnesium is it's relatively cheap to supplement and it's safe to supplement. You've got a very, very high toxicity threshold. So if you're putting in amounts of magnesium that are safe and you are also seeing a behavioural response, and that is good. That is telling you that there was likely something going on with magnesium in your particular horse. Another thing that can increase your horse's requirement for magnesium is nitrate in their forage. So plants will take nitrogen out of the soil in the form of nitrate, and then they store that nitrate in their stems and their leaves until they use that nitrogen to build protein out of it. So forages can accumulate very, very high levels of nitrate. And if your horse is on a high nitrate forage, what that means is they will need to excrete the nitrate from their body. And to do that, what normally happens is that the nitrate will bond to a cation. So it can bond to things like sodium or calcium or magnesium or potassium. And then once it's bonded to one of those things, it can be removed from the body. So if you have got a horse on a high nitrate forage, so say your hay or your pasture is cycling, because it will increase and decrease in pasture, but if your pasture is cycling through in high nitrate phases, which will typically be early in the morning or on cloudy and windy days, are really high risk periods as well. But you may find, particularly if the diet and the forage is low in sodium, you may find that horse is actually dumping a whole lot of magnesium to get that nitrate out of their body, and then you might get changes. So again, if you're seeing odd behavioural changes in horses and you've got either lush green grass or you've got forage that has either been tested as high nitrate, in which case you probably shouldn't feed it, or you haven't got a pasture or hay test and your horse has got strange behaviour and everything else checks out, you've checked all the other things that we've talked about, and you can't find anything else that might be contributing to that behaviour, then magnesium potentially will help. So it's a good one. The next one that's really common in calming supplements is vitamin B1, and sometimes at massively high levels. So the tricky thing with vitamin B1 in the research that I was able to find is that there are no studies looking just at vitamin B1. So it's always been alongside something else, and we don't actually know whether it's having the effect or something else that is being fed with it is having the effect. But what we can say is that vitamin B1 is definitely tied up with nervous system function and behaviour, and that if you do genuinely have a horse that has got low levels of vitamin B1, then you may well see behavioural changes associated with that, and therefore supplementation with that vitamin will help. But I don't think we need it in the crazy high amounts that we see in some supplements on the market. So making sure that requirement is met, and if you need to, going up a little bit above requirement, but not necessarily at hundreds or thousands of % of that horse's B1 requirement. And the other thing to keep in mind too with vitamin B1 is that if you are feeding for a really healthy hindgut environment, the microbes that live in your horse's hindgut will produce vitamin B1 for your horse. And so they do still have a dietary requirement for the vitamin, but it is going to be much less than if you've fed in a way that's wiped out your good fibre fermenting microbes, and you no longer have microbes in the hindgut that are actually producing vitamin B1 for your horse. And then the last ingredient that I want to talk about specifically is tryptophan, because so many calming supplements contain this ingredient. And to me, I think the little bit shocking realization is that we continue to see calming supplements being formulated and manufactured with this ingredient, despite there being no scientific evidence to support the fact that it actually changes behaviour in horses. There is no evidence to show that it has a positive influence on behaviour in horses. So the research on this ingredient goes right back to 1994, could go further back, but that's as far back as I went. So Bagshaw et al. 1994, and they found in a study where they put mares in isolation in a stable where they couldn't see or touch other horses, and they gave them a single dose of oral tryptophan, and they found that it did not calm the horses. And actually the horses that were supplemented had increased heart rates and activities, suggesting in that study that there was a stimulation effect rather than a sedation effect. And then we have Malcolm Dist in 2007, where they gave a commercial dose of 6 grams of L-tryptophan, and again, no significant effect on fear responses or heart rate, and no positive effect on novel object reactivity or ease of handling in young horses. And then we had 2 papers from Glennis Noble, 2008 et al. And 2016 et al. And Glennis showed that a commercial dose of tryptophan did raise blood tryptophan levels substantially. So that's good. At least we know that it's being absorbed into their blood. But the 2008 study showed it didn't translate into a meaningful calming effect on behaviour. And then the 2016 study showed that at a really high dose, it was something like 160 grams, 60 grams of tryptophan in a single dose. And they actually say in the paper a single oral tryptophan dose is not an effective calmative in horses. So even when you're giving them massive levels of tryptophan, it's not doing anything. And then the most recent paper was Davis et al. 2017. And this one was interesting. So they had supplementation, and it could have been over a longer period of time, not a single dose, but they showed it had both a sedative and an excitatory effect on physiological stress measurements, but it didn't change reactive behaviour of the horses in that study. So if you're looking for a calming supplement, so, you want to calm your horse for when you ride it or when you take it to a show, they showed no calming effect. So the evidence is well and truly against tryptophan as being an effective calming supplement in horses. And if you're using it, you're probably best to save your money and use it on something else for your horse or in your horse's diet, because there just really, really isn't the evidence to show that it is changing their behaviour. What you'll probably find if you do have a supplement with tryptophan in it is that it also has things like magnesium and vitamin B1. So those may well be having an effect on your horse, but it's really unlikely that the tryptophan is going to be having any sort of positive effect on your horse's diet. There's lots of other ingredients that are present in calming supplements. A lot of them are herbal. And to me, herbal medicine is a whole other area of science. It's not nutrition. It's essentially medicine. And I think to make proper comment on herbal supplements, you do need to be a properly trained and educated and experienced herbalist, which I am not. So I'm not going to go delving into, the more herbal type supplements that we use for calming supplements. But hopefully that covers off the 3 big ones for you: magnesium, vitamin B1 and tryptophan. The biggest takeaway I'd love you to remember from this podcast episode is that there are so many reasons why a horse's behaviour will change, and that behaviour is information. And I remember a gorgeous guy, I've mentioned him on the podcast before, and I really wish I could remember his real name, but he was nicknamed Dr. Doolittle. and spent a little bit of time with him on their thoroughbred spelling pre-training and potentially I think also training farm. But I remember one of the days we were on this property and he said to me, oh, go in and say hello to that horse. And it was this gorgeous little chestnut, and I've got a very soft spot for chestnuts, so beautiful little chestnut filly, thoroughbred filly. And I went in, she was all smoochy and happy, and we had a big cuddle. And he said to me, it was a matter of days before, he said she probably would have tried to kill you if you went in the box with her. I was like, oh, great. Thanks for sending me in. But you wouldn't have known. She was so lovely. And I remember him saying to me, I think his name might have been Tim, but I remember him saying to me, there is no bad horse. That was his belief. There is no bad horse. And if they're behaving in a way that is undesirable, it's just them trying to tell you something. So I'd really encourage you, if you do have a horse that is behaving in a way that is unsafe or hyperactive or just in a way that is not what you want, and you want them to be, like, there's nothing nicer than a beautiful, calm horse. And I absolutely love I pulled my favourite horse, Dellinger, out on Saturday after, I think I've ridden her once in the last couple of months. And I was like, you know what, I just want to go for a ride, and a nice, enjoyable ride. And I pulled her out of the paddock, gave her hay as I was saddling up, and then rode her out the gate. And I call her Little Miss Hot Feet because she just loves to move. She's not rushy. She's dead quiet, but she just likes to move. So we'd wandered out the gate, loose rein, and then we started trotting up the road. And I would have been happy to keep trotting. And she was like, I might canter. And she just popped herself into the most beautiful canter. I was like, righto, well, this feels nice. We're just going to stay here. And at the time I was thinking, wow, this is amazing. Like, she's just 5 and she really hasn't done much work in her lifetime. And yet I can just go and pull her out of the paddock, jump on and canter up the road on loose rein. It's just a really beautiful collected canter. It's what we have consistently with all of our horses. And it's not because we're amazing horse people, because we absolutely are not. There's so much I need to learn around actually, riding and training and all of those things that go with owning horses. But their behaviour is lovely because I know that their gut is lovely. I know that their stomach is comfortable when we ride them. I know that their diet is balanced. I know that our pasture doesn't have mycotoxins that are affecting them. All of those things that can affect their behaviour are not in my horses' lives. Occasionally they will pop their heads up, in which case we find whatever the issue is and deal with it. But it's noticeable how calm my horses are. And, they're big spread of ages and breeds, even our off the track Allay, like Tamara will jump on her after not being ridden for weeks and weeks and weeks, and she just wanders around, rides her around on a loose rein. So there's just no sort of behaviour in her. And yes, partly it is her temperament. But I know that I could turn her into a fire-breathing dragon if I fed her in a certain way as well. So just be nice to your mother, Tamara, or you might find your horse turns into a fire-breathing dragon. Anyway, all of that to say that if your horse is not behaving the way you want it, please go back and trawl through all of the things that we've talked about and try to identify what might be going on. Download the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. Put their diet through there. You can see the energy levels on the free version, and there is a 7-day free trial. You can check mineral balance. You can check vitamin B1 levels. You can make sure that there is, all of the nutrients that your horse needs in there to be healthy, and that the forage levels are right and the forage diversity is good. All of those things that lead into having a happy and healthy and lovely and calm horse. So thank you. I know that was a lot, and I hope that I managed to give it to you and give you all of that information in some kind of sequence that you can follow and it makes sense. Thank you so much for being here, and I will catch you in the next episode. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.